I now declare this 31st meeting of the Standing Committee on Public Accounts in order. Welcome again to our guests. Our apologies for the inconvenience. And to let you know that there's yet another bell coming in about a half an hour. It doesn't necessarily mean we have to rise. It does mean we will need unanimous consent of the committee to continue. But I also need to advise colleagues that we need at least a 5-minute committee meeting to talk next steps. Otherwise, we don't have any. So we do need a couple of minutes. If the bell is going to happen in half an hour, and it's a half hour, it is a half-hour bell, I believe. Yeah, it's a half-hour bell. So we could go until the regular time, 5:30, with unanimous consent, and then just shave off somewhere between 5 and 10 minutes before that so that we could do committee business. We can either decide that now, or I can bring it to your attention as we get closer to the end of the meeting. Mr. Albus. Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I really want to get to the witnesses, so I'll be brief. I like the second suggestion where you can bring it up that time. The reason being is that we have a number of members that would like to ask questions, and I'd like to be the focus of that today. If that means expiring all the time on that's fine with me. However, we could always look to then to Monday as a time to do some planning for other activities. But again, this is the Conservative choice, and we asked specifically so many people here. I'd like the focus of us to be on the witnesses and their testimony today. Agreed. I hear you. I would just mention, though, we don't have a lot of, the only real committee work that we have is planning our business. We're caught up on the drafts. So I leave that with you. I agree that we can go that second way. Let's get going. Everybody ready to get into the round of questioning? Okay, good. So with that, I will then begin. Oh, a couple of things. One last thing before I do. I have the pleasure to bring to the attention of colleagues that Assistant Commissioner Gilles Moreau will be celebrating his 35th anniversary with the RCMP tomorrow. Congratulations, sir. Well done.
Thank you.
It's good news. Take it.
Yes.
Because you never know how the rest of the meeting is going to go.
And I'm only costing you 30% of my salary.
All right, colleagues. We will begin. Mr. Falk, I'll look to you for lead-off, and so we'll give you a moment to get yourself up to speed and those glasses.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I'm just checking my list here. And okay, I think we're ready. Mr. Falk, you have the floor, sir.
Good. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for your patience with my delinquency. I'd like to direct my questions to Mr. Watson. Mr. Watson, one of the questions I have to start off with would be how much will future taxpayers have to pay with respect to the pre-2000 pension liability?
The pre-2000 liability, I believe, is $150.1 billion. The Actuary-in-Chief is nodding his head there. There are contributions that are already made against that. My colleague from the Department of Finance could talk about the specific treatment of it, but those are the total liabilities that are there today. And again, there are contributions that have been made against those liabilities at points in the past before 2000.
Okay, and what kind of consequences could that create for taxpayers going forward?
Well, one of the things that the Government of Canada has done and been a leader on is ensuring that those liabilities are clearly understood, that they're fully stated in all our public accounts, and so there are no surprises there at all. My colleague from the Department of Finance could, I suppose, if you want, provide a little bit more detail on that front. But again, we collected contributions on that, and the liabilities are well established and in the public accounts.
Okay, thank you. Also, as far as the plan, how are the investment returns for the plan, and when does the plan expect to return to a surplus position?
Sure. The plan has been performing very well over the last 10 years. It has beat the target rate by considerably. The target rate, I think as we talked about last week, was 4.1% on an actuarial basis in real terms. And in fact, it has performed at approximately 6.1% over that time period, including in one of the most significant meltdowns in the recent history of the stock market.
That's a very good return. Can you also tell me, are all three pension plans lumped together as far as looking at it from an investment?
From the post-2000 period, yes, they are. They're all managed by PSPIB. Colleague Mr. Valentini here will be able to speak some of the specifics there, but yes, they're all invested in the same
Aggregated as far as an investment?
Yes.
Okay. And what would your views be on the C.D. Howe Institute's criticism of the government's accounting standards used to report pensions?
Well, I'm working hard on managing the plan that I am managing and working with folks on that. I would say that we follow all of the required standards for reporting. I would note that the Auditor General has seen fit to give us an unqualified opinion 15 years in a row, the Public Accounts of Canada, which, to the best of my knowledge, no other major country in the world has come close to.
Okay, Mr. Chairman, I'm satisfied.
Great, thank you. Over to Monsieur Giguère. You have the floor, sir.
Mr. Giguère, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And I'd like to apologize for the ins and outs here today. My first question has to do with your overall vision. Because when I read the report, I get the impression that there's been a short-term approach rather, but we're talking about long-term items. A long-term vision, therefore, might be good. So I'd like to know what would have been the advantage of having a long-term vision in terms of the $151 billion after 2000. So for national defense, there are problems with our Veterans Affairs. I'd like to know if this is a structural problem or if it's something that will resolve itself over time with some administrative reforms. So would it be good, for example, to merge Veterans Affairs again with National Defense for that purpose or not? So in terms of the capitalized funds, there are various agencies. There's Radio-Canada, there's Via Rail, for example, there's Canada Post. Would it have been a good idea then to bring those all together in the same management fund? So we're talking about 20, 30, 40 years down the road in terms of using these funds, these macroeconomic funds. So this is the kind of information I think that could be relevant. So if you agree with that, do you think at some point in time you would undertake a study into that? For example, take the RCMP. What would be the long-term impact of unionizing police officers, for example? So let's say in 20, 30, 40 years, they're going to be using those pensions. What would be the impact then? So just quickly, in terms of Crown agencies, there are about 40 Crown corporations that fall under our plan. So they already are closely linked if you look at that context. Now, after post-2000, we are actually planning for the next 15, 20 years, and my colleague, Mr. Valentini, could expand on that. So it really depends on the kinds of investments. These don't necessarily pay out right away. And we're really just paying out 14 years. It's only been 14 years since that post-2000 period began. Now, I think that's about all I would have to say. Perhaps Mr. Valentini would like to expand on how the fund could be structured, knowing that there's still another 20, 30 years before they start paying out. Well, to speak to the long term then, our investment strategy really does focus on the long term. We have funds that we are managing since 2000, and we won't be paying out before 2030. And so what that means then is that we can use an investment strategy that allows us to diversify our assets on private markets. So there'll be more liquid ones, less liquid ones, because we don't have to sell those assets. So it does give us a competitive edge. Perhaps what I would say is that one of our competitive advantages is our liquidity. Our investment horizon is very, very long-term. I think it'll be more than $200 billion worth before we have to pay out. So there's this bonus effect that gives us an advantage, and we've already seen that in the returns. So that's an important factor in managing our cash assets. So if you have a 2% surplus every year on that 4.1 that you need, over 30 years, you're going to have a really nice surplus, a really nice actuarial surplus. Well, 2% over 10 years is significant, yes. What we are doing is focusing on and targeting a 4.1 rate. So if we do that, we'll be happy. Now, we had referred to the deficits in the past, and the last actuarial assessments were done more than a couple of years ago. The markets were very good over the past 2 years. There are many hypotheses about this, many hypotheses that we use when we're doing those actuarial assessments. But we look at our investments, we compare them to what we were doing a couple of years ago, and I would say that actually that deficit will be wiped out completely. We feel that we're using good portfolio investment strategies and that we'll reach that 4.1. Now, the $151 billion in terms of the $151 billion, we feel that we're in a good situation. And as a corporation, we have the resources and we have the means to manage those funds if the government decides to transfer them.
Before I go to our next speaker, I do want to ensure that we have in the record that all of our guests and witnesses are the same, with the exception of Major General Daniel Miller from Department of National Defense could not make it, and in his stead we have Commodore Lynn Bisson, who's the Assistant Chief of Military Personnel. Welcome and thank you for filling in for the Major General.
Thank you very much, sir.
Very good. All right. Now, my understanding is that Mr. Aspin and Mr. Carmichael would like to split their time. Jay, you want to go first? Great.
Thanks,
Mr.
Chair.
Aspin, you have the floor.
Thank you, Chair. Welcome, guests. In the past couple of years, our government has made some changes to the public sector pension plans. For example, raising the eligibility for full benefits from 55 to 60, and evening the contributions at 50-50. So I guess my question to Ms. Cheng is, after reviewing the administration of these pension plans, would you say that the government's changes would have a positive effect for taxpayers?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So the exercise that we undertake was to look to see whether there has been an assessment of the sustainability of the public sector pension plans, including all three plans, the public sector, the RCMP, and the DND. What was proposed to us or shown to us was the result of what come out from the analysis that supported the two measures that the member has mentioned. They both have a positive impact on the liability moving forward. They alone, though, does not support the fact that there has been a full assessment of sustainability, and that was the observation we made in the chapter, as well as the recommendation to suggest that a regular assessment be undertaken periodically.
Thank you. Mr. Kermit?
Yeah. Well, thank you. And welcome back to our witnesses. Ms. Cheng, following up on my question to you from our last meeting, seems like a long while ago. I wonder, in your answer to me, we agreed that the returns that we're hearing about in this pension program, a series of pension programs, was pretty strong. But through the report, I noticed in your early chapters of this report, 1.11, and 1.12, 1.12, you talk about strong volatility and prolonged period of very low interest rates. You talked about longevity of Canadians has increased and some of those issues. And what I'm wondering is, from the perspective of our pension plans, are you finding, or do some of your colleagues have any information that what we are experiencing is common, let's say globally or throughout the world, other areas where you might be able to compare like plans? And do we have any data as to how we compare to others in terms of our productivity?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for the question from the member. The scope of the audit relates to assessment of the administration of the pension plans that we've outlined, the three main pension plans. It does not include an element of benchmarking. So as a result of the audit, we have not gone out to compare our plans and our situation with other plans.
Okay. Thank you. Well, Mr. Watson, do you have any thoughts on that same question?
So in terms of the assessment that we do in terms of the long-term sustainability and the comparisons to others, certainly PSPIB benchmarks itself against other pension plans in Canada. When it comes to the questions of longevity and the turbulence, these are things that are all very much factored in as part of the work that we do with the Office of the Chief Actuary. The PSPIB spends a lot of time working on these things. You'll find in their reports issues related to changes in salaries. I know the member had asked earlier about impacts of different labor relations issues. We factored differences in salaries, differences in rates of return, differences in longevity. I think last time we talked about the fact there's a $7.7 billion cushion in there to deal precisely with questions like longevity. So these are all considered.
So your comparatives, though, are strictly within Canada as a rule?
The biggest ones that we would look at are the ones in Canada. We certainly follow trends from around the world, but it gets very difficult to compare very different plans under different sets of circumstances. But we compare closely what's going on in the rest of the country.
Great. Thank you very much.
Good, Mr. Carmichael and Mr. Aspin. Thank you both. Moving along, we're back to Mr. Giguère. You have the floor again, sir.
Mr. Chairman, we're talking about a governance framework that doesn't include a funding policy. Now, this is another issue of long-term vision. When you have a pension, you can't necessarily look at 2 or 3 years into the future when the average age of a public servant is about 36 years old. So that planning period should correspond to that time period. So what I'd like to know is, how could you come back to us with a proper funding policy that's more long-term? Well, we are actually working on it. We have been this year, and we do hope that it will be ready for the next fiscal year. A lot of work has already been done on that. For example, at PACP, they have a risk tolerance document that they've been working on, and the chief actuary is looking at risk elements. And in the legislation itself, it's stipulated that you can't have any undue risk. And we've developed our own policies. And we're just about to make that official over the next few years in terms of our proposals. And you will see it in the next fiscal year. I'd just like to follow up on what Mr. Carmichael was asking about. I have looked at comparing this with other plans, not just public plans, but private plans as well. And the Canadian system is quite stable when you compare it, say, for example, to the European system. Oftentimes, debts weren't included in the budgets. and which we didn't do, and after 2000 has been fully capitalized, fully funded. And so my general opinion is that despite the fact that some corrections have to be made, the Canadian system is quite solid. And if there's anything that you might want to correct me on about that, please do so. But in my opinion, Canada's public pension plan is very disciplined and solid. Well, I would agree with what you're saying, and I would add, with respect to your point about deficit and debt, the last assessment was made on the 31st of March 2011. Markets have changed since then. They've become more positive since then. Now, when another assessment, the next assessment is done, then we expect to see an even greater improvement on that deficit situation. Obviously, we'll have to wait for the official evaluations and the official numbers, but that is what we would expect to see. Would the witnesses from the Office of the Superintendent of Financial Institutions like to answer on this then? When you're expecting an average return, usually actuaries expect there to be some negative years, some positive years. Now, we've gone through a more difficult period of time, but if you were to project over 40 years, do you think we'll be seeing a downturn, or do you think we'll be seeing something different over the long term? Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. In the actuarial report, there are several tests that are presented. And we all know that assets can provide, shares can provide additional returns. And so we can take that into account. Now, there are various scenarios. For example, if the correlations are in the future are the ones that we've seen in the past, then, for example, 1 year out of 10, you might get a negative return. You might get minus 10%. But 1 year out of 10, you might also get a 22% return. So there is that volatile nature of the returns. Now, we have this 4.1% hypothesis. When I compare that to the 10 biggest plans in Canada, and I'm referring, for example, to the Ontario Teachers' Pension Plan, to the REGOP in Quebec, I think that really we are aligned with our counterparts elsewhere. Now, in the Auditor General's report, this is referred to, that is, interest rates are currently quite low, and we do take that into account. So over the next 10 years, even over the next 5 years, our projections aren't 4.1, they're 3.1%. So why? Because we need to acknowledge the fact that interest rates are low right now, and financial markets might be facing more challenges. So what does that mean then? What it means is that that can increase, and if we compare that 3.3% to the 6.1%, and PSIB continues to perform well, well then obviously yes, that deficit will be reabsorbed quite quickly.
And now over to Mr. Hayes. You have the floor, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This is going to focus on the pension buyback. So Mr. Watson, I'm looking at the AG report 1.2, and it states that according to the Secretariat, the government could generate significant savings if service buybacks were reviewed. And the Secretariat believes that the current method of costing them based on contributions and interest does not provide an accurate reflection of the true cost of the liability of the service being bought. And the RCMP, according to their plan, their service buyback provisions better reflect the true cost of the liability. I'm trying to understand why the two plans are different, and is there an intention to align these? And I would think that all buyback plans would be identical. So I appreciate your comments on that.
Right. I think this goes to the governance questions that were raised in the report that we agree with fully. Over time, plans developed in different ways, and there were different practices historically, and it's time now that we accept what the Auditor General has recommended and improve some of the governance issues. So buyback would be a good example of the type of thing where we need to look at the best practices across all of the different plans that we've had over time. It's a situation where we had a particular approach that might have been fine at the time, but strategies change and sort of understandings of how to best do it change, and it's time for us to get to that work, and we will go ahead and do that. I don't know if my colleague, Ms. Gowing, has anything to add to that?
Sorry, with respect to the service buybacks, yes, we're aware that we need to bring the how we do the methodology up in line with the RCMP and the Canadian Forces. However, we wish to look at it from a holistic approach that all the plans are aligned that way, and we're going to get that work done.
Is there an anticipated timeline where something like that might be considered and implemented?
We're looking to get something in line probably in the year 2015-16.
And Mr. Morrow, any comments? I expect you probably agree with what's being said, but you might like to add something at all?
No, absolutely. I think that the plan needs to be aligned, and of course, our pension buyback provisions have been changed about 3 years ago, and that's why they're perhaps more reflective of today's reality compared to others that were older. So we used that opportunity to put them into today's reality, and I know that we did that with Treasury Board Secretariat in consultation with them, and so
thank you. Yes. Ms. Cheng, in section 1.17, you mentioned for the purpose of this audit, we examined selected responsibilities assigned through legislation. And, myself as a legislator, or all of us on this committee, would you recommend that legislation be amended in any way to change the responsibilities of the President of the Treasury Board, the Minister of National Defense, and the Minister of Public Safety? Was that a recommendation that came out, that as legislators we should be looking at changing the legislation in some way?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The recommendation we made was to the departments and agencies involved, the entities involved, to see how they can work together to work within the current legislative framework. Now, if the legislators see fit to streamline that and make it easier for the various departments and agencies to do so, so much the better. But the recommendation wasn't begging for a legislative change, and I think in the responses that you see, there's good agreement from all parties involved, and they feel that they have mechanisms and ways to work within that legislative framework. So we're not prescriptive in terms of suggesting that legislation needs to be amended.
How's my time, Chair?
A little over a minute.
Mr. Menard, as an actuarial, how many of you folks exist in Canada? And do you meet on a regular basis and kind of compare notes? Because, you bring forward different scenarios, and plans are built around those scenarios. So we need, obviously, a level of confidence that the scenarios you're bringing forward are realistic, and I don't doubt that they are. But what can you tell me in terms of your field and how you determine different scenarios?
Yeah. Thank you for your question. I'm a member of the Canadian Institute of Actuaries, and there's more than 2,000 members across Canada. But I would like to refer to use your question to explain. Of course, when we do assumptions, for example, we have to consult with experts and with our colleagues in Canada. But we have also, for the Canada Pension Plan, an independent peer review that was put in place in 1999. And it's 3 actuaries from the private sector, sometimes academics, who look at the most important assumptions. And I want to talk about 2 assumptions that have an impact both on the Canada Pension Plan and or on the public service pension plan. These are longevity improvements, and the second one, the real rate of return on investment. And in the most recent peer review report published in May of this year, they said, well, mortality, fine, but maybe you, if we were those guys who would have select the assumptions, maybe we would have used a different assumption. And they were looking at more improvements, something that was raised in the report of the Auditor General. On the other hand, the real rate of return, they look at our assumptions and they say, well, maybe you are in our reviews, you are too prudent. So there were, and amongst the 10 major assumptions, 3 were they would have select a different assumption. Inflation, they would have select 2%. We have 2.2%. Mortality improvements, as I said, and real rate, the rate of return on investments. But this process is extremely important for us to, let's say, recalibrate and consult more when there's a need for that.
Merci. Thank you. And time's expired. And now over to Madame Jones. You have the floor, ma'am.
Thank you. And thank you again to our guest, not just for your information, but for your patience as well. My question is relative to 1.12, and it again, I guess it's interesting when you look at the longevity piece and what's happening in Canada with regard to the pension plan, and you start making a comparison, as noted in your report, that in 1970, for instance, there were 41 working years of a normal person in the public service, with 14 retirement years. In 2010, that was 39 working years and 23 retirement years. And you know, it's amazing and startling when you look at that number and you start realizing the impact that it has on the pension plan in the country, and the challenges of ensuring the sustainability of that plan. Now, I realize that the decisions in the 2012 budget were taken, obviously, to lend itself to the sustainability of the plan, and hopefully to increase the savings over a period of time. And I think the year you quoted was 2017 to 2018 fiscal year. So my question would be, actually it's 2 questions. One thing you note in your report is that while the trend of longevity has increased, and you expect it to continue in the future, you're expecting it at a slower pace. And I'd like to know what the indicators were that would allow you to draw that conclusion. And the other question that I would have is that when you made, when government, I guess, made some changes in terms of raising the pensionable age by 5 years, and also to increase the employee's share of the contributions to 50%, do you think this is going to be adequate in terms of the sustainability piece, or will we be looking at further changes that could come within the next few years? So two parts to my question.
So, thank you, Mr. Chair, for the question, the member. If I can start with the second question, it's not the type of thing that you can simply do once every 5 or 10 or 35 years to make sure the plan is safe. You have to look at it on a constant basis. And so everything from the 90-day reports that we get from PSPIB to look every 90 days at how the funding is working, to the constant work that we do with the Office of the Chief Actuary to revisit not only the assumptions that we've made, but whether or not there are other assumptions that we haven't thought of yet that we should bring in. Constant analysis and review of changes in things like longevity or mortality rates, morbidity rates, other things like that. The type of work that the Chief Actuary has talked about in terms of working with his peers to make sure that the analysis that his office brings to it is constantly the most up-to-date possible. But then also to look at the nature of the plan itself, which goes to the work, for example, the work we need to do on the funding plan, which recognizes the cycle of life that the pension plan is in. So obviously the post-2000 plan is in a very different situation than our obligations from the pre-2000. Bringing all of those things together is part of the key work that we do to ensure the sustainability. So again, you do it constantly, not just sort of periodically. I'll let my colleague, the lecturer en chef, talk to the longevity issues because he's the real expert there.
Yeah. I would like to raise, let's say, three issues. First, you mentioned the slower pace. First, we mentioned that there's already a provision of $7.7 billion to take into account the expected future improvements. Behind that number, what it is, it's between age 15 to 84, we are projecting a reduction of mortality rates by 40%, almost the same as the last 40 years. Now, if you look at work done, let's say, at the international level, the country which is the most aggressive in terms of longevity improvements in the future is UK. And it's done through what they call the Continuous Mortality Investigation Project. And although we are projecting people at age 90 at almost the same level, the people reaching 100 is very different. In other words, they have much more aggressive reduction in mortality rates for those between 85 to 100. The point here is that, so the point is that it's another difficulty for the doctors and the humanity to reduce mortality rates significantly at age 95. It's much more difficult than at age 65.
Great. Thank you. Madam Cheng, I know you wanted to get in. You're anxious. I'll give you 30 seconds to get your message in.
So thank you, Mr. Chair. It's just trying to address the second question from the member about the adequacy. The audit did not try to assess whether it was adequate. We asked the government officials to be able to show us, to demonstrate that they have assessed the sustainability. They show us two measures whereby they've made changes. They said there were additional work that was done, but we were not able to see that. So we received a management representation, but we could not give you the assurance that that information has been audited.
Very good. Thank you. And that concludes the time. Thank you. And we have enough for a 4-minute round from Mr. Albus.
Perfect.
And at the conclusion of that, colleagues, I will adjourn. We do have at least one other piece of business as well as future business to look at between now and the rising. So upon Mr. Albus concluding, I will thank our guests and adjourn the meeting. You have the floor, sir.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Thank you to our guests. Mr. Watson, last time we were talking about the Secretariat improving its capacity by hiring staff. I'd like to go to 1.49. where the issue of intergenerational fairness was also addressed in the draft policy. I'm going back to what Mr. Hayes was discussing about earlier and in later documents. However, at the time of our audit, the policy had not yet been completed. Can you just let us know whether or not that this has been looked at and worked at by the Secretariat?
Yeah, we will continue to work on it. It was something that was part of our earlier work. Again, we haven't completed, but we continue that work, and that is a very important part for us to make sure that you don't have one generation paying for another in an unfair way. In fact, we're trying to set up the plan so each generation pays for itself as it reaches retirement.
And I think that's very, very important to note, especially considering that people that are working today are paying more into their pensions, so that they will be paying and effectively funding half of their retirement. I think is a good thing. I'd like to go to Assistant Commissioner Mr. Moreau. Congratulations on 35 years, and I'm very happy you got some kudos earlier from my colleague. However, what I read in section 1.68, and it says the RCMP, and this is going, Mr. Chair, in regards to the obligations vis-a-vis pension plans. There's a comment, the RCMP, for example, argued that it would be risky to implement governance principles that are not specifically set out in legislation. Now, what we heard from Ms. Cheng earlier said that there was agreement from all parties that different departments, again, I like it to a trustee position. So legislatively, you've been given the task of creating a pension for your members. It may not be spelled out in legislation that you have a trustee role. Would you say the RCMP has taken a step back from this particular opinion and is moving more towards a trustee position when it comes to governance and working proactively with other members such as the Treasury Board Secretariat?
Well, absolutely. We do have that role of a trustee, and we have been working in that fashion for all the years that we've looked after the plan. And we are committed to participating very, very actively into any new structure that TBS will put in place as far as governance is concerned, and to make sure that the plan is sustainable in the long term, and not only to just administer the plan, but to be responsible for that as well.
Okay. So why was the RCMP cited out for this? Was it, has your opinion changed since going through this process?
Well, I think it's basically to make sure that, you know, we want to stay within the framework of the Act that governs our pension plan, and we want to make sure that we follow those rules in the administration of it. But of course, we always look at it in making the changes that are necessary legislatively. For example, with pension portability, what we introduce is something that is more modern than perhaps the other two plans, and we did that working with the TBS officials and in consultation with DND, and we will continue to do that in the future.
Great. Okay, and I'm going to go back to the Treasury Board Secretariat 1.70 is the part there. There is a risk that not all aspects related to the appropriateness of the design and funding are adequately considered in various decisions. Now, will the creation of a senior interdepartmental committee facilitate a better approach to dealing with these kinds of issues on design, et cetera?
Yes, this process will bring, I think, a different type of rigor to work that we were already doing. I think the way I described it in an earlier question was this will, we think, make much better sure that nothing falls between the cracks. We will have formal meetings at very senior levels to make sure we consider all these issues directly.
And how much time do I have, Mr. Chair?
45 seconds.
I'd like to just direct a quick question to Mr. Valentini. Before, when I was on the government office, I had the fortune of listening to your presentation on the PSP IB's investment in infrastructure in various countries, partly because of the returns on it seemed to make sense, given that you have a very strong mandate that you can't put people's money at risk, but you have to beat you have to return the 4.1, or at least now what Mr. Menardis says, the 3.1% ratio of real return. Now, I'm just asking, is it part of that have to do because infrastructure typically has more of a monopoly type situation? It's more recession-proof. Those kinds of assets that perform well even when the economy isn't doing well.
Very briefly, please.
So your question is to why we invest in infrastructure assets?
Yes.
It's part of an overall diversification strategy, and infrastructure as an asset class. We call it a real return asset. It has less volatility than equities, and it is very much linked to inflation. So it is very attractive in a asset mix in a pension plan because of its attributes. So not only is it linked to a real return asset like inflation, it's also a private asset. So you capture what we call an illiquidity premium. And there are not many investors that have the capacity to invest in these types of assets because they are big ticket items. We've done transactions of over $1 billion. So it's a less competitive environment, less crowded, and we're able to invest in these assets and hold them for a long term. Because of our liquidity advantage. We don't have to sell assets or pay out liabilities before the year 2030. So we've invested, for instance, we've made major investments not only in infrastructure but renewable resources in forests, where the holding period for those investments are well over 10 years. So these are assets that will not necessarily return 20+% returns. They will provide stable returns. They are less volatile and basically fit well in an asset mix in a diversification strategy because of their attributes.
You do. Thank you. And all of our guests, or witnesses today. I do appreciate your patience and your testimony today.
Great. Thanks, Mr. Elvis. And indeed, thanks to our guests. Commodore, you need to send an email to Major General Miller and let him know that you're not sure what the big deal was. This was a piece of cake.
I'll make sure I do that, sir.
Thanks for your presence today, Commodore. And all of you, thank you for your indulgence. Our apologies for the inconvenience of interrupting it. Makes it no less important. Thank you all very much for your fulsome answers. And colleagues, we now stand adjourned until our next usual meeting, where we will be meeting to do business. This committee room and this meeting now stands adjourned. All in favor, please leave.